Happy Monday. Happy October, everybody, and welcome to another Drama is Life, where we talk about mental health and social topics across the lifespan with the purpose of increasing awareness, decreasing stigma regarding mental health, particularly or in all the community, period, but particularly among African American and faith based communities. So, hello, hello, hello. I am Theresa White, your Drama is Life host. We have been doing this for 3 years, so this is your first 3.5 years, almost four. This is your first time joining us. Welcome. We welcome you to comment, ask questions, share, like, subscribe, do all of that. This is meant to be a conversation and just giving you some information. This is not to replace a therapy session by any means, but we want to give you information, and this is based off of my work and experience. I've been a therapist for 14 years. I am the CEO and founder of End Time Creative Counseling Services, and I'm Theresa White, if I haven't already said that. In private practice here in Terre Haute, Indiana, where we offer drama therapy, expressive arts, and traditional therapy here in the Wabash Valley, and of course, all of Indiana. So if you want information about our services, please make sure that you reach out during our office hours because we'll talk about that a little bit then. But tonight, I want to talk about have you heard? Have you heard? So October, this is definitely the harvest month, as we talked about last week and even our previous month. And we talked about the changes that are happening with regards to this month. But our topic tonight is about a few other types of changes that are not so pleasant. So I want to invite you to have a conversation. I will give a disclaimer that there may be some triggering content because we will be talking about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So if you want to know more information, please feel free to stay with us. So again, we are here in the Indiana area. And so we are offering in-person online services as well. And so I just want you to come in, have a seat, whether you are cooking dinner, maybe a little bit late for cooking dinner, but if you are, come on in. As you have this listening in, I definitely want to have a conversation as this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so tonight I want to talk about the myths that you have heard regarding domestic violence. So with regards to that, hopefully I wouldn't have any technical issues like we had last week. So please, as you come in, say hello to me, wave, wave, hello, hello. So glad to see everybody that's going to be joining. So if you join after the live, you're still welcome to share, like, subscribe. But just be aware that we are here every week. If people say if the creek don't rise, and in the Wabash Valley, it possibly could rise. Hopefully it doesn't though. So I just want to have a conversation and just give some information. I want this to be an overview of what domestic violence is, what it is not. And then we will go as our weeks come up following in this month. We have a few Mondays in this month that we will be talking about specific populations in regards to domestic violence, such as women, children, men, etc. So again, as you come on in, let me know that you are here. Say hello to me. I would love to be able to say hello back to you and give shout outs. So I do want to ask a question starting off. What is domestic violence? And of course, the name gives away a little bit of the hint. But what is domestic violence? Hello, good evening, BJ. Welcome, welcome. So I want to give, if for those who may not know, or may just hear the term and it's not really something that what's the word? It's not really something that you hear often, right? Or you hear it explained. I want to give you the definition. I'm going to give you just kind of the basic definition of domestic violence. But I want to hear from you first. It's something that has definitely, and I won't say destroyed, but it has broken a lot of trust, brought a lot of trauma, and it has broken some relationships, bonds, families, broken up some families. Um, and so, a lot of when we talk about domestic violence, it's definitely something that, if you've heard of DCS or if it's the DCFS and whatever it's maybe called in your area, you probably hear a lot with regards to DCS or DCSF. Again, depending on what it's called in your area. So I want to give you this definition as this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we want to bring the point of bringing awareness. So it is a pattern of abusive behavior in any relationship that is used by one person to gain or maintain control over another. And in this definition, it says intimate partner. But one of the myths that I want to, first of all, have a conversation about with regards to myths, as I said, has you heard? So, have you heard? Um, is that domestic violence only happens between intimate partners? That's not true. Um, and I say that because throughout history, a lot of, you see probably movies and TV shows, and I'll share a few of them. I know enough with Jennifer Lopez. It's a movie that is about domestic violence and it's between intimate partners. It's the one that's off the top of my head at the moment. I can't think of any others, but if you can, please make sure you put those in the comments, share those with me. But that is something that generally is believed about domestic violence. You hear the term, and people are generally looking like, okay, that must be with dating relationships, or that's happening with the married couples, those kind of things. And that's not the case because the word domestic means home, means that home family. So domestic violence, first of all, can definitely happen. If you don't hear anything else I'm saying tonight, I want you to hear this, that it can happen with romantic partners, which is a lot of times where people report it, or that typically happens, or not typically happens, but it is heard. Since the topic tonight is have you heard, it is heard to more often with regards to a romantic partner, but that's not the only domestic violence relationships that are happening. So, and we'll get to a little bit more of that. Domestic violence only happens in poor families. Anyone ever heard that? Have you heard that? So you can give a thumbs up, a yes, if you've heard some of these myths. Domestic violence only happens in low income, impoverished, or poor families or poor communities. And I don't know, again, myths are myths, and they typically are started from some level of someone believing that that's true. And maybe at one point in time, only it was reports happening more often. So people probably got a lot of statistics that happened more often, or they was only reporting what was happening in low income families. So you probably only heard that that was a factor in these relationships. But domestic violence happens across the board in every economic status. Doesn't matter whether it's a low income, high income, and a lot of times people who may have higher incomes just maybe have more money to be able to cover things up. I'm not sure. That's just my theory on why it may be. But it's so not true. I definitely agree. It's not true. It's not true at all. But domestic violence happens in all kinds of families, rich and poor, urban, suburban, rural, in every part of the country, every race, religion, age group. So I want you to hear that every race, every religion, every age group, it does not discriminate. So think about that. Violence does not discriminate. Now, again, people say that you have a higher risk when you are in a lower income family or socioeconomic status. But again, that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that is the factor. There's a lot of factors that are happening in higher income statuses as well. So again, across the board. So, myth number 2: alcohol or drugs, or alcohol and drugs, are the cause. And I'm getting some of my source from this is from Safety, Hope and Safety. So alcohol and drugs cause domestic violence. Has anyone heard that one? And again, what do they show in movies? You probably have seen it in movies where when what we call the perpetrator, which is the one who is causing the violence or the abuse, typically has a bottle of alcohol in their hand. And this is not alcohol, y'all, it's water. I'm trying to work on my water, remember that. They got a drink, they got, maybe it's some cocaine or heroin or some type of illicit substance that is present with regards to domestic violence. Now, again, in some cases, that may be, but drugs and alcohol are not the main factor or the cause of domestic violence. Actually, poor boundaries and trauma a lot of times is. And just the abuser wanting to control, as we gave the definition of what domestic violence actually is. That's the cause. Power and control is the cause. A lot of times the root of desire to have power and control. So alcohol does not cause domestic violence. There's a lot of people who are sitting in bars or who are who drink alcohol or who do illicit substances that have never physically harmed anybody. So it's not the cause of that at all. That's not also to say, in the same token, that doesn't mean that it cannot exasperate someone being violent, but that doesn't mean that it causes domestic violence. So let me clarify that. Someone who you may have again seen some things in movies or just experiences in your own families, lives, etc., that someone who may be under the influence of an illicit substance may definitely have more or less of a filter of self-control, and that may lead to a fight, altercation, violence, etc., but it is not the cause of it. A lot of times unresolved issues and not, again, power and control is that cause. So just wanted to make sure that we get that one out there, that alcohol and drugs, and it's not always, not only is it not always the cause of it, it's not always involved either. Somebody who may be not only even just a victim of domestic violence, but someone who is the perpetrator may have never used alcohol or drugs. So again, that myth, we want to make sure that if you heard that, that's not true. And we'll be talking a lot more in depth about these situations and what to look for. Abusers and or victims have low self-esteem. Again, when we talk about myths, there can be some truth to some of the myths, but myths typically are very broad and stereotypical. And so they're not true for every case. There may be some who are abusive that do have low self-esteem, but that's not the case for everybody. Abusers don't always have low self-esteem. They maybe believe that they're entitled, as I said before about power and control. They're entitled to controlling somebody, entitled to having power over somebody or over this person, whoever that may be, the abuser or the victim. So again, low self-esteem is not always a factor when it comes to domestic violence. It can be. It's now survivors, because I don't like to necessarily say victims, but survivors of abuse may have had their self-esteem tore down hugely if they've been in a violent relationship. But that doesn't mean that they have or have always had low self-esteem. But and we'll talk about that a little bit as well in our future weeks, but one of the tactics or techniques, I won't even call it a technique, one of the tactics that an abuser may use is to degrade the person, to tear them down and attempt to make them feel like that they are less than or not good enough, and very strategically do that with regard. So that maybe, of course, that's a factor that can be a result for a survivor, but doesn't mean that they, again, always have low self-esteem. Domestic violence is not something this is another myth. So have you heard? So again, let me, say or say yes if you've heard these. Domestic violence happens only once or twice in a relationship. And again, I say that because a lot of times people take these myths based off of the movies that they see or productions, in the media. And I say media as in like movies, mass media. So or even with regards to maybe a situation that may be on the news. So you may hear the survivor, or the person who's being abused or has, experienced the abuse, may say, well, it's never happened before. This is the first time, or it's only happened twice. So if people get that, hear that statement, it's like, okay, this is not an everyday thing, or doesn't happen all the time. And again, the abuser may not abuse every single day. They're again, they're the person, whoever they may be abusing, but that doesn't mean that it's only happened once or twice. When we say the definition of domestic violence is a pattern, which means this is happening, it's a pattern of behavior. So it's not a once or twice situation because it's a pattern. So again, I want you to hear that. And this, so I'll just say that and leave that there because we'll go deeper into that a little bit later. Another myth that I want to share, is that this is a really sad one that I don't like. So I even have a problem saying it out loud, but I'm gonna share it with you because I think it definitely needs to be dispelled and completely annihilated. And those words used intentionally, that the victim is deserving. And I'll say this because it's the actual myth says some women want to be beaten. They ask for it, they deserve it. So they go from abuser to abuser. So it must be something about them. You must be, and now there's this big statement, or these, I don't say this big statement, but this kind of flow, or idea of the law of attraction. So people will even try to shame someone who has been through abuse or who has been abused. So you must have attracted that. Something in you attracted the abuser. So the problem with being someone who's been abused or been through that type of trauma, there's already shame, there's already guilt, and there's already self-blame. And so this myth, that's why I say it bothers me, because it just continues the cycle to say that the victim or the person who was abused, it's their fault that they were abused. They asked to be abused. Not at all. The other part of this myth that's a problem is that it says women. And so I'm going to let you know, as I end with these other two, because we won't go into all the myths because it's so many, that women are not the only ones who have been beaten, who have violence in a relationship. And that's the problem that people don't really see. So when we talk about awareness, I want you to understand that domestic violence happens in every type of relationship that's a home, because domestic just means home. So anybody in the home can be what we call a survivor. I don't like the word victim, but even with that term, a victim of domestic violence. If you're in a home, so who's in a home? A mother, a father. You have children in the home. Some people have grandparents. Some people have their parents in the home. So when we say domestic, it is really condensed down to looking at a partner relationship, because they typically thinking mother, father, or romantic partner type of relationship, but that's not the case. Domestic violence, the umbrella of domestic violence is also that there can be violence toward the male. There's violence toward the woman, there's violence toward the man, there can be violence toward the children. Now we typically call that child abuse, but that still falls up under domestic violence because you're being violent towards someone in your home. There's also what we call parental abuse that falls up under domestic violence. And that is one that is missed often. And we'll talk more about that in future weeks, because I want to go more into detail about parental abuse. Because we live in a day and age where people are very shocked and surprised. And again, movies glorify a lot of things, or put it on the screen, and it's glorified, where the children are violent toward the parent. And again, it brings shame on every regard. So good evening, Mother Nellum. Good evening, Terry. It brings shame on any regard. So imagine being a parent and you want to go tell someone my child is beating me, there's not anyone who wants to tell anybody that somebody's beating them. I don't mean it that way, but that brings even more shame because people will look like, what? And you've seen some of the responses in movies or even in the community, probably. Your child? I would never. And then it goes into what you would do. I would never let my child A, B, and C, D, E, F, G. So if the person is experiencing that, they shut down. As we learned our word from Deaf Awareness Month last week, that this means to shut up, they shut down. They just completely shut down because it's like, oh, well, yeah, you would never. And then it goes into a inward shame. So I want to say that when we talk about domestic violence this month, I want to bring awareness to the home relationships that violence can be happening in between intimate partners or parents, from a male to a female, from a female to or from the mother to the father, from the father to the mother. So yes, men also are victims of domestic violence. Children, as we call it, child abuse, which that's more common. People know about that one. Um, but also there are parents that are victims of domestic violence from their children. Not talked about enough, I know. So, um, and the other one is that um, people who are children who are witnesses, another myth, is that it's twofold. I'm going to share two of them. One is that children are not aware, right? They don't know what's going on. First of all, I say that because I say that that's a myth, and that is so untrue. Because if you live in a home, it's very difficult to not know what's going on. And again, so if you've heard this one, I want you to definitely let me know if you've heard this one. That children don't know that domestic violence is going on in their home. How many people have ever walked into a room? How many of you have ever walked into a room and you walked in and you can feel the thickness of tension, or that's when you walked in, you're like, something just happened in here. And I have no idea what it is, but you can feel it in the room. And then everybody's in the room acting like, well, hey, Theresa, as if nothing's happening. You're like, what just happened? Because you can feel the energy radiating. You can feel the spirit radiating of whether it was an argument or tension, whatever it may be. You walked in and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and go back out. Anybody ever had that situation happen? I have a few times. You walked into business meetings and you're like, what just happened? Walked into families' homes, you're like, what just happened? And you feel like you just walked into a war zone. You're like, what is going on in here? You feel that. And of course, that wasn't always when you were an adult either. I've had that experience as a child where I walked in and was like, what just happened? From parent, arguing with their child, or to aunts and uncles, or my mom and my aunt, or whoever, right? You just kind of walk in like, what's going on? And so what they typically tell children is you stay in a child's place. That's what a lot of people heard in their family, and that you're not around adults during conversations for this very reason, which is probably why this myth has shown up as well, because people thought that children are just silenced and you move them out of the room, you put them away, put them away, they stay away, so they can't possibly know what we're trying to hide over here in the room. But that's a very hard secret to keep if there's a serious pattern of power and control that leads to violence and abuse, or abuse and violence, I'll say it in that order. Because who we would definitely notice that if people are not able to identify it, if a child is not able to identify it, doesn't mean that they're not aware of it. So, and then the last one that we'll end with on tonight is that children are people, and I will say people, because it can be also adolescents as well. So not always the little children, but people who have witnessed domestic violence, and even if it's been as a child, will grow up to also be either abused or the abuser. That is also a myth. Now, studies have shown that there are some people who, again, because children are learning, they're constantly absorbing their environment, and what you teach them, as we all have learned in our lives, will come out in life in other patterns of relationships in their own lives. So there is definitely some people who become abusive physically that has been in a home of someone who's abusive. But again, that's someone who has been exposed to that in a very intense and repetitive way over several years or a long period of time. It's more likely. It's very unlikely for someone who has seen, maybe witnessed it once or twice, so all of a sudden they're going to become an abuser, or they're going to be the one who is perpetrating violence in the relationship. So that is a myth. But we still want to make sure we address the one who has witnessed it, especially if it's children. We want to help the ones who have experienced it as being abused, and we also want to help those who experienced it as being the abuser, because everybody in this situation, again, everybody in the domestic, in the home, needs help. Everybody. It's very hard to, as I always say, my theory with regards to healing is that we hurt within relationships and we heal within relationships. It's very hard, which is why, when we talk about family members or families that have been broken up by violence, it's very hard to just say we're going to just send, and in this case, I'll say the abuser, the ones who is violent toward the family members. Yes, we're going to send them away and get them counseling, get them help, and they're going to go to jail or whatever the consequences may be for them. We're going to put them in programs, but then leave the one who was abused and then the children, to just leave them without any support or resources. No, everybody that was ever a witness or experienced it, and I say experience doesn't mean that you were the one abused, but experience means you could have been also a witness to it. Anyone that has experienced domestic violence needs the help and resources to heal, because that is it's just a traumatizing. I don't know anybody who's not experienced trauma that I've worked with that has been that experienced domestic violence in their home. So, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I want you to be on the lookout. So people, and we'll talk about those things when people who have been abused, some of the things that they say or do, some of those patterns of those who are in an abusive relationship, and those who are also, I won't say perpetrating, but those who are the abusers, and some patterns to look for. Because sometimes we can have some of those destructive patterns in our own lives. Doesn't mean that we're abusive or that we're violent towards somebody, but we can definitely have destructive patterns that I want you to be aware of, so we can actually correct those and get some help to change those patterns into some that are more appropriate and healthy for your relationships. So thank you so much for joining for our first week, and kind of our overview of Have You Heard? And I want you to listen out. You may hear a lot of conversations or see some events going on in your community. Hopefully you do, since it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I know it's also a celebration month where people are, out buying candy and getting masks and things like that. So this is definitely a season that is really easy to hide, because makeup is celebrated in this season. We can use all kind of makeup. So some things that you may see, and may not be makeup, may not be a mask. And then some things, of course, metaphorically may be to hide the fact that abuse is going on or that violence has happened in their relationship. But again, won't get ahead of myself. We'll get a little bit further into that when we talk more about that in our future Drama is Life lives. So feel free to ask questions. Even if you're watching this after the live, I'll always come back and look at the videos to be able to see comments and questions. So I would love to hear. I'm definitely available in the community if you want to have a conversation about it. I think we need more awareness about it. We don't talk enough about the violence that is happening in the home and behind closed doors. So I want you to not only to look out for, because sometimes we can watch, we don't always hear some of the language of domestic violence. And as you heard some of the myths around domestic violence and the language that's in the myths, I want you to know that if you hear those, that you can also speak up and say, that's not true. Again, it's not just only in, as we review them, they're not only in low income families or the poor communities. It happens, around every social economic status, race, religion, nation. Um, it's no respecter of person, as we would say. And so, people who, and as I said, women, or that our second one, I mean, not skip over one, alcohol and drugs cause domestic violence. That's a myth. Domestic violence is, or abusers or victims have low self-esteem. Again, that's not true. It happens only once or twice in a relationship. Again, it's a pattern of behavior. That's not true. And then also some women want to be beaten. Again, that one just blows my mind when I read it and when I say it out loud. I'm like, what? Okay. They ask for it, they deserve it. This statement definitely sounds like someone who is abuser, who perpetrates abuse or who excuses abuse, and that may need some help themselves. Some women go from abuser to abuser, and it must be something about them that they're attracting. Again, no, the victim is not being shamed in this situation. So, and I say this also that it's not just women who are beaten, which is why this is a double myth. This happens in males as well, children. Some people have parents in their home, so it can be elderly abuse can also happen within the domestic home. So again, we'll get into that a little bit later this month. So thank you for joining as we talked about some of these myths. And every child that has ever witnessed abuse does not turn out to be an abuser. So listen in. Next week, we will be talking about some of those patterns of behaviors to look for in a destructive relationship, or if your patterns are destructive, if you have some power and control tendencies in your relationships, or even with other loved ones. So again, thank you so much for joining. Like, share, subscribe, and we hope to see you back here on next week. You guys have a safe week. Enjoy the coolness of the weather before it gets too cold while the sun is still shining. Hopefully we'll see you back here on another Drama's Life. Have a great week, you all. Bye-bye.